Okay, it's 3:30. We're going to start our brand new GSO Student-Alum Networking Discussion and Seminar Series. So welcome to all of you that are here. This is our first one that we're kicking it off today. So I just want to welcome you all and also let you know this is sort of not your typical seminar series. It's really more of a networking series. And so each of these, and we're planning to do these monthly. We'll have a half hour where one of our alums will speak about his or her career path and about the present work that they do. And they'll be open up for questions, and that will be open to the public. And we'll be advertising that as we have for this on Facebook, Instagram, out to the alum listserv, out to the GSO Bay Campus listserv. And then after that, we're going to turn it over to the present GSO students, particularly Sarah Wickford and Diana Fontaine, who are going to then moderate a discussion with the alum speaker. And at that point, we'll ask people who aren't students and recent alums to leave the platform. And then we can have the speaker and the students and the recent alums can have an informal discussion about careers and career paths and all. So that's our plan. So it's a little bit different than a typical seminar. So that being said, now that you understand, I want to make sure everybody's on mute. Peter, you've made sure everybody's on mute, right? Okay. And then we would like to have David Smith, who is our in charge of, actually, what is your title, David?
Associate Dean.
Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. And he knew our speaker at the time, and so he's going to introduce him. So please, David.
Great. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I'm very happy that this forum has taken off here. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Matt Baumann as our very first speaker. Matt joined us in 2008. He just earned a chemistry degree from Carthage College. And he came here and he was working up on the second floor of Horn in Brad Moran's lab. He did a lot of work up in the Arctic under what was called the BEST program. It was at Bering Sea something, and Bering Sea ecosystem study. He published his parts of his dissertation in Journal of Marine Research, Deep Sea Research, Journal of Geophysical Research. And he finished up in 2013 and then went to industrial economics up in Massachusetts, and now he's down in South Carolina at the Department of Health and Environmental Control. And I just assume, Matt, that you are still a Blackhawks fan. Is that true?
Yeah, still, for the time being anyways.
Okay, so it's a real pleasure to see Matt back, and I'm very interested to hear about his path.
Sounds good. Thanks, David. No, it's good to be back with the GSO community, even if it's in this digital format for the time being. And I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Veronica, for getting all of this squared away. This is a good opportunity for the students to hear kind of what comes next. I've left GSO 7 years ago now, and I've done a lot. And I'm going to try to highlight a few of those projects here. And I apologize for the rather unimaginative title, but I promise that the talk is more interesting than the title suggests. My plan for today's talk is to highlight a handful of projects that I've worked on in both the private and public sectors over the last handful of years. The projects and focus areas are pretty diverse, but really most everything when you leave GSO relates back to public environmental policy in some capacity. The path I've taken has been a bit of a winding road. I didn't always know what the next step was, and I'm okay with that. But I think a good place to start with is what came before GSO. As David said, I entered Carthage College in 2004. Carthage is in Kenosha, Wisconsin, pretty little campus on the shores of Lake Michigan. I actually entered undergrad on a pre-pharmacy track. I graduated in 2008 with degrees in chemistry and entrepreneurial studies. The entrepreneurial studies program was in essence a crash course minor in technology-based business where we took a patent from concept and rode that all the way through to a fully functioning business plan. My REU in 2007 pretty much reshaped what I wanted to do with my life. I think that's a testament to really the effectiveness of undergraduate research programs like REU and SERFO. They really do work. For my project, I used lead-210 and beryllium-7 to look at sediment transport through the Milwaukee River watershed. Back then, I was green. I didn't know a whole lot, but I liked the concept of using naturally occurring tracers. I liked field work, and I liked working with alpha and gamma counters. So I thought that might be a good place to go next. After the REU, I contacted Brad Moran because his lab was in the thorium-234 game, and they did a lot of work in high latitude regions. Both of those thoughts were very appealing, and his lab had just received funding for a multidisciplinary study in the Bering Sea that David alluded to, and he brought me in to work on it. 5.5 years later and a whole bunch of sea time later, we ended up with a nice thesis on seasonal particle and carbon dynamics in the Eastern Bering Sea. And big shout out to Pat Kelly if he's listening in, because without him, this thesis wouldn't have been possible. So Pat, if you're out there, thanks. In this thesis, we asked 3 specific questions. First, where do surface produced particles aggregate on the seafloor? This question bared on things like shelf base and particle exchange and the potential for deep sea carbon storage. Second, how much primary production is exported from the surface ocean and in relation to sea ice? This question addressed upper ocean particle organic carbon export efficiency. And lastly, who are the phytoplankton players responsible for what we learned in the first 2 chapters? 2008 to 2010 were cold years in the Bering Sea, and what we were trying to do here is basically provide a basis for interpreting future observations in a warming Arctic. I'm highlighting my grad work here not as a humble brag or anything, but kind of as a point of reference for how much the course was about to change and how much it really continues to evolve. So in 2014, Industrial Economics, or IEC, hired me on as an associate. IEC is a pretty diverse company, at least at the time, and had about 100 staff. The company specializes in a lot of different areas, including natural resource management, public policy analysis, applied and natural resource economics, information technology, and some other areas. The 2 areas that I want to highlight are natural resource management, specifically natural resource damage assessment, and climate change public policy analysis. So IEC brought me in to work on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. After that, I kind of migrated on into other project areas after that wrapped up. But just as a quick refresher, take us back a decade or so. In April 2010, a blowout of the BP Macondo prospect off Louisiana killed 11 people. Over the course of the spill, 4.9 million barrels of oil were discharged to the northern Gulf of Mexico. The cleanup response for the oil spill is absolutely massive. It included skimmer ships, booms, controlled burns, and millions of gallons of dispersant. I'm sure a lot of those images come to mind from a decade ago. The environmental impacts to open water and pelagic and benthic ecosystems were immeasurable. The coastlines of 5 states were severely oiled. Socioeconomic losses to the northern Gulf were huge, and after the spill, NOAA launched a major legal response under the Oil Pollution Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. The feds effectively threw the kitchen sink at this legal effort, and it worked. In July of 2015, BP settled for $18.7 billion, which at the time, and I believe it still is the largest corporate settlement in US history. What came in between? I want to spend a little bit of time discussing that. So natural resource damage assessment, or NRDA, is a process to determine the appropriate type and amount of restoration needed to offset impacts to fisheries, wildlife habitats, and human species and human uses impacted by oil spills, hazardous waste sites, and vessel groundings. Typically, there's 3 parts to a NRDA. First is a preliminary assessment where we'll make a determination on if we really need to proceed. Second, there's the injury assessment and the restoration planning aspects. And lastly is the actual restoration component. For injury assessment, the trustees, along with their consultants and academics, conduct scientific and economic studies to quantify losses or injuries to the natural resources in question. In the restoration phase, a suite of usually 5, maybe 6 projects, restoration types, are assessed to determine how much restoration is necessary to compensate for these losses. Obviously, these are all quantified in dollars. So in 2014, when IEC hired me, the injury assessment was well on its way and restoration planning was just ramping up. Deepwater Horizon was absolutely massive. It wasn't going to be like any NERDA that has ever been conducted. The trustees realized early on that injuries for this magnitude couldn't be described at a single species level or even on a regional scale. Instead, the focus for restoration planning was on the ecosystem level using representative habitats or resources. My work on this project focused on fisheries-based restoration options and salt marsh invertebrate recovery. As our fisheries folks know, shrimp trawling is an indiscriminate fishing practice that produces a lot of bycatch. I looked at how much finfish biomass could be saved by getting some portion of the shrimp trawl industry to switch to more effective bycatch reduction devices. My other primary focus, and this was probably the larger of the two, was developing recovery trajectories following restoration for representative marsh species, specifically periwinkle snails and amphipods. Recovery trajectories provide guidance on how much restoration may be necessary to compensate for losses. They're not the whole story, but they're a big piece of it. These recovery trajectories were based on published literature characterizing marsh restoration through time and discussion with subject matter experts, which were a lot of the academics residing along the Gulf Coast. Prior to Deepwater, there really wasn't a whole lot of literature out there characterizing marsh restoration. And since then, and following Deepwater Horizon, we've been building up this understanding on how marsh recovery actually works. And a lot of this work that we did here provided a lot towards that goal. The recovery trajectories consider things like life histories and mortalities of the invertebrates. Amphipods turn over relatively quickly, but periwinkles are more interesting in that they're extremely long-lived and develop slowly. I didn't know this at the time, and when I was getting started with it, these little snails can live for more than a decade, so we do need to consider in life histories and really trying to understand how they recover over time. So to produce the recovery trajectories, we use linear mixed models to estimate % recovery of these invertebrates at age of the marsh restoration project. And we were making a whole lot of progress on these projects, and then DP settled. So we had to figure out kind of what comes next here. So to wrap up, as part of the Deepwater wrap up, we ended up publishing the recovery trajectories in estuaries and coast. We also published a larger scaling model, which uses the recovery trajectories to quantify marsh benefits or benefits associated with marsh restoration. But marsh restoration projects rely on more than just the recovery of a single specific resource. Other considerations have to include things like project life, reference marsh conditions, physical completion of the project, gradual erosion of the marsh platform, how much of the project footprint is actually marsh. Annual benefits need to be discounted over time because resources today are more valuable than resources tomorrow. And we need to consider net benefits here, which is the difference between a future with and without project. So you compare the benefits between installing a new marsh or just letting that what could be the footprints just kind of sit idle. If you're interested in learning more about Deepwater Horizon, the final PDARB is available to the link here. I caution that it's not exactly a brief read, but there's a lot of information here on injury assessment, restoration planning, habitat types, who were the trustees, as well as how the state spent early restoration funds. There's a lot of good information here, and if you are interested, I encourage you to browse around here. So IEC also has a pretty well-rounded group that focuses on impact characterization, adaptation strategies, and mitigation scenarios associated with climate change. They specialize in modeling and characterizing physical responses in the environment and the economic implications of climate change. They also evaluate adaptation strategies to counter climate change. Most of that work is funded through the World Bank. They've had projects all over the world, including in Uganda, Albania, Macedonia, Moldova, Uzbekistan, and Madagascar. I want to focus here on a climate impact change study that centered on Alaska that I was involved with. I think I can broadly classify it as both an impact study and a mitigation assessment. It's no surprise to this audience that the high latitudes are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Temperatures are rising much more rapidly, freeze-thaw cycles are intensifying and threatening permafrost, and the coastal ice-free season is lengthening, which tees up coastal communities for winter storms. We all make great observations. We wouldn't be at GSO if that wasn't the case. But if we want to translate these observations into policy, we need to consider economics. We need to consider what are the social and cultural costs associated with climate change? What are the threats to infrastructure? What are the benefits of adapting for the future? Really, because the bottom line is always money. So what does the future hold for Alaska's public infrastructure? Most of the state is underlain to some degree by permafrost. It's mostly sporadic in the south around Dillingham, Bristol Bay, and up through Anchorage. And once you get to the North Slope, it's mostly continuous. And in between, we have discontinuous and isolated permafrost. So we used a series of 5 general circulation models to estimate future damages to Alaska's roads, buildings, airports, railroads, pipelines under 2 climate futures or representative concentration pathways. RCP 8.5 is considered the business as usual climate future, and RCP 4.5 is a future in which we do some greenhouse gas mitigation, but not a whole lot. We also considered scenarios in which we adapt public infrastructure for what we think is coming versus not adapting at all. The results indicate that there are about $3 billion in benefits to both reducing greenhouse gas emissions to some extent and proactively adapting Alaska's public infrastructure. I will caution that these estimates don't also include the having to potentially relocate entire coastal communities that are eroding away. For this project, I made some estimates on how I think the coastal ice-free season is going to lengthen through the end of the century, under the 2 climate futures. We have an idea of current erosion rates for a number of these at-risk communities, and I calculated total erosion based on those rates and how I think the ice-free season is going to lengthen at various parts along the Alaska coast. These are only basic first order estimates, but there is a real possibility that a number of these communities are going to have to retreat from the coast in the coming decades. In fact, that process has actually already begun for Newtok in 2019. The total cost for this one community is estimated at more than $100 million. And I have a link to an NPR article kind of characterizing what's going on in Newtok at the end that I'll share with y'all. So in late 2016, I left IEC. It really was a wonderful ride there, both professionally and personally. But in early 2007, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control hired me on as an aquatic scientist. And the remainder of this talk focuses on a few of the larger projects I've led during my time here. As a quick overview on how EPA and the states interact, EPA delegates many of the charges of federal laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act to the states to oversee. One of those provisions is Section 303D of the Clean Water Act, which is my section's primary focus. Broadly, the goal of Section 303D is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. The states are required to maintain a list of impaired waters that are not meeting standards, and the feds require us to establish priority rankings for these waters. Finally, we need to do something about this list, which usually involves a total maximum daily load or some other remedy for the water body not meeting its established use. So what our section does is we typically review waste load allocation recommendations for the National Pollution Discharge Elimination Program. NPDES permits authorize entities like wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities to discharge wastewater to regulated waterways. For most cases, things are pretty basic. We can evaluate a discharge using a steady state critical condition dissolved oxygen model. I will admit, though, that we are getting asked to evaluate larger discharges to smaller waterways, and things are becoming increasingly more complex year over year. In some cases, though, a steady state or even a calibrated dissolved oxygen model is just not enough. This is the case for larger TMDLs like the Charleston Harbor, where we considered 14 discharges together, scattered across the Ashley, Cooper, and Wando rivers and the harbor itself. We used a time-varying EFDC model for hydrodynamics and water quality and coupled it with an LSPC watershed model. The goal of this TMDL was to estimate reductions for the discharges necessary to achieve a TMDL target of a 0.1 milligram per liter dissolved oxygen depression. This TMDL was finalized in 2013, and I also have a link for this project at the end in case you want to read more about it. So for the last 3 years or so, I've been heading up our field program in the Lower Catawba River Basin. The watershed is located between Charlotte and Columbia in the north central part of the state. The basin includes an approximately 100-kilometer stretch of the Catawba River from the Lake Wiley tail race at the North Carolina-South Carolina border through Lake Wateree near Camden, just north and east of Columbia. The lower half of the river is made up of 4 stacked hydropower reservoirs: Fishing Creek, Great Falls, Cedar Creek, and Lake Wateree. All of these reservoirs are owned and operated by Duke Energy. As far as large basins go, this one is basically our state's problem child. It's very shallow and it's seasonally very, very eutrophic. It's heavily urban in the north, as it includes most of downtown Charlotte and its rapidly growing suburbs in York County, South Carolina. There's also a lot of cow pasture in the west and northwest. The lower half is mostly forested, but there is a lot of forestry and timbering that does occur here. There's a large number of dischargers along the river, including a large pulp and paper plant. As a result, historical phosphorus loadings to the basin are very high. So in the early 2000s, the state adopted lake standards for total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and chlorophyll A. Following this, we contracted out some modeling and implemented phosphorus load reductions for the dischargers. As you can see, total phosphorus loadings by both North and South Carolina to the system decreased, as did lake concentrations at a couple of our monitoring locations in Fishing Creek Reservoir. However, concentrations and loadings are still relatively high, and more than 30 locations within these reservoirs are currently impaired on the state's 303D list. But what you'll notice here is that there's not many chlorophyll listings here. Really, there is only one, which indicates a possible mismatch between the nutrient criteria and algal growth in this system. I mean, a really good argument can also be made, which we are making, is that the statewide lake chlorophyll standard of 40 micrograms per liter is simply just too high. So the dischargers in this system are aware of these issues and the need for further nutrient load reductions. So they organized their own group and requested another round of model review. Their arguments were that, which we agree with, that the data that we have are just insufficient. The old WARMF model is just inadequate, and the current systems aren't correct in this system. So the dischargers supported some pretty rigorous basin-wide sampling in 2017 and 2018 to kind of justify their points and to indicate that they kind of wanted to steer the ship here. So we agreed to consider new data, a new modeling effort, and to develop site-specific criteria for this basin, but we're taking the lead here. The dischargers aren't. But to fully characterize this system and to develop sound nutrient and chlorophyll criteria, we need specialized data. So we decided to extend and expand the 2017 and 2018 discharger efforts, and I led a couple of programs in 2019 and 2020. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here highlighting what we did in the basin in 2019. The primary objective of our 2019 program was to generate data sufficient to develop site-specific nutrient criteria for the Lower Catawba reservoirs. To meet this objective, we developed a number of sub-objective or program components, and I'll discuss a few of them here. The first program component was to resolve the Lake Wylie tail race. We selected that as our new model boundary. If we want to have a decent model for the system, we really need to have a good handle on the physical and chemical characteristics at the boundary. So here's that part of the system. You see Lake Wylie here, just south and west of Charlotte, next to Fort Mill. We sampled directly from the boat landing, and just looking up from the boat landing, you can see the Lake Wylie powerhouse there. The second program component is to understand nutrient loadings to the river and the lake from the primary types of land use in the basin, so that we can accurately simulate loadings basin-wide using a watershed model. As I mentioned earlier, the dominant forms of land cover in the basin are urban, semi-urban or suburban, hay pasture, and forest. So we analyzed all of the subwatersheds in the basin against a number of criteria to find reference watersheds that best represent the dominant forms of land cover in this basin. There were a number of criteria that we considered. They're all listed here on the right, but the two most important were that the candidate watershed couldn't have an established NPDES discharger, because that would really impact our understanding of nutrient loadings from the land cover type. And second, the watershed needed to be covered by a high percentage of the dominant land cover type. So once we homed in on our watersheds, we selected stream sampling sites and contracted with USGS to install flow gauges. Our third program component was probably the most intensive piece. Here we wanted to develop a comprehensive understanding of the seasonal evolution of hydrology, chemistry, and physical characteristics and ecology of Fishing Creek Reservoir and Lake Wateree, the two largest reservoirs in the system. To do this, we conducted routine sampling of chlorophyll A, photosynthetic pigments, full water column hydrological profiles, light penetration, and we pulled data on a large suite of water quality and nutrient parameters. We established 4 sites in Fishing Creek Reservoir and 7 sites in Lake Wateree. These lakes are typical run-of-the-river impoundment, so they do express upstream to downstream characteristics. So the sites that we selected in these lakes were meant to capture these gradients and also help us understand what's going on in the larger and more stressed lake arms in these lakes. And you'll note here that the scale on these maps are very different. Lake Wateree is about 7 times the size of Fishing Creek Reservoir. So at each site, we pulled a pretty comprehensive suite of nutrient parameters in both the dissolved and total fractions. We also collected common water quality, chlorophyll A, and photosynthetic pigments to give us an idea of total phytoplankton biomass and community structure. We also resolved vertical and temporal hydrology for a number of key parameters, including temperature, conductivity, pH, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, fluorescence, and phycocyanin as a measure of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. So beyond our biweekly routine lake sampling program I just described, we also compiled a whole bunch of new bathymetric data to update the geometries and storage and residence times for Lake Wateree, Fishing Creek Reservoir, and Cedar Creek Reservoir. We also installed continuous monitoring buoys at multiple stations in both lakes. We installed a weather station with solar radiation at Wateree State Park. We partnered with EPA to do some sediment oxygen demand work and nutrient flux at 5 sites in Lake Wateree. EPA also installed 2 more continuous buoys for us in Lake Wateree. We also partnered with a different EPA group to do algal growth potential at 7 sites in Lake Wateree, which provides us some good insight into nutrient limitation on phytoplankton growth. And just as a little bit of a teaser on the algal growth potential, almost all of the sites that we selected in Lake Wateree were characterized as nitrogen limited, and not phosphorus limited. We also partnered with the dischargers contractors to do some lake sediment grain size and sediment organic carbon content analysis. We did some intensive vertical profiling to understand daily cycles throughout the water column. Coastal Carolina University also installed a continuous vertical profiler near the Lake Wateree Dam. And I think the point that I really want to make here is that, pardon me, is that no one really achieves anything alone here. We formed a lot of partnerships along the way here. And I think once we get all of this data pieced together, I think we're going to have a really nice story to tell and a really sound understanding of how this system behaves. As I noted earlier, this system is stressed, and that's a big reason why we're out there. I'm actually getting ready to submit a paper with Jay Pinkney from USC, characterizing phytoplankton community structure through the 2019 growing season. These lakes absolutely bake in the summer. Surface temperatures exceed 25 degrees C in early May. They max out between 33 and 35 degrees in August and September, and they don't dip below 25 degrees C until mid-October, so they're hot. Early and late in the growing season, the phytoplankton community was a relatively homogeneous mix of chlorophytes, cryptophytes, diatoms, and cyanobacteria. But even at these points in the season where we have a relatively homogeneous community, cyanobacteria still make up around 30% of the phytoplankton biomass. In late summer, cyanobacteria expand their presence to up to 70% of the chlorophyll A. And at that time, the water column starts to exhibit large daily swings in dissolved oxygen and maintains persistent elevated pH. At our one buoy in Lake Wateree, the minimum daily pH exceeded the state standard of 8.5 on 24 of 30 days in September. So those are pretty good signs of a high level of eutrophic stress. So switching gears here, this is my last topic. It's probably not a surprise to anyone here that PFAS are an emerging public concern both here and abroad. They're a broad class of between 3,000 and 5,000 synthetic fluorinated organic chemicals. Production of these compounds began in the 1940s. These chemicals have the unique properties that both repel water and oil, so they have virtually limitless commercial applications in things like nonstick cookware, food packaging, stain-resistant fabrics, and metal plating. They've also been used in firefighting foams, cosmetics, and as industrial surfactants. Two of these compounds, PFAS and PFOA, are the two most widely studied because they were the two most widely used. Though they're now phased out of production and use, PFAS was an important component in aqueous film-forming foam or firefighting foam. Because of their ubiquitous presence in commercial products, waste streams. They end up in our waste streams and landfills. They can be discharged from certain industrial facilities. They can be emitted to the environment through application of municipal sludge and treated wastewater. Septic systems are also a very real source for PFAS release. So there really are a lot of environmental pathways for PFAS to enter the environment. They're generally considered or commonly considered as forever chemicals. They're highly persistent and they resist degradation. This is part of the reason why they're so widely used commercially. Now, despite their widespread use for more than 50 years, PFAS weren't observed in wildlife tissues until the early 2000s. Since then, research has been scaled up and we've increased our understanding of their bioaccumulation and biomagnification tendencies. In 2016, EPA released drinking water guidance for PFAS and PFOA, and over the last 5 to 10 years, states and tribal governments have moved to better understand potential PFAS impacts in their states or territories. This also includes us here in South Carolina. So early last year, the state implemented its PFAS drinking water strategy to assess PFAS concentrations in the finished water in all of our community water systems and at-risk wells. Over the last year or so, I've been heading up our team developing the state's surface water strategy. Our broad goal here is to get insight into how widespread the problem is environmentally. This includes a characterization of PFAS in surface water, sediment, as well as associated biota. We're almost done here. The strategy is currently out for internal review, and we hope to have it finalized next month. We're focusing on 7 primary PFAS environmental source types. Those include Department of Defense or energy sites, airports. We have a firefighter training academy here in Columbia, just north of town. Landfills, certain types of industry, which include organic chemicals, plastic and synthetic fibers, textiles and pulp and paper industries, wastewater treatment plants receiving industrial pre-treatment, and land application sites for domestic and municipal sludge. There are others, but we had to kind of limit our strategy here, as you can see by the large numbers associated with some of these large source categories. South Carolina has 8 major river basins: the Savannah, the Saluda, Broad, Catawba, Edisto, PD, Salkehatchie, and the Santee. Within these major river basins are 175 HUC 10 level watersheds. And we use the HUC 10 classification level as the basis for our strategy. You can see here, there's about 600 active and inactive landfills. They're pretty ubiquitously distributed across the state here. You can see the same sort of applies for our industrial facilities. They're evenly distributed with some concentrated areas up in Greenville, Spartanburg, some here in Columbia, as well as down in the Charleston area. The same concept generally applies for pre-treatment, publicly owned treatment works, though there are fewer of them. Sludge land application sites are more concentrated in the upstate and in the PD regions. There really aren't that many below the fall line or on the coastal plain. So we pooled all of these data together along with our airports, our DOD and DOE sites, and the Columbia Fire Academy, and identified priority HUC 10 level watersheds in each major river basin. We used major river basins as a primary grouping consideration because we wanted to ensure as equal representation across the state as possible. And also by going at the watershed route, we can readily scale up or down the strategy if necessary, depending on resources that are going to be available to us to actually implement this strategy. So the plan here is to develop a specific sampling plan for each watershed based on the numbers and types of sources present and the relationship to the watershed stream network. If all goes according to plan, we'll start developing a sampling plan in the first half of this year and begin sampling next winter. Just to sort of round out discussion, I want to zoom in on an area just east of where I'm currently sitting. Here's a higher resolution map of a few of our target watersheds east of Columbia. Within these watersheds are 4 military bases. The large one in the northwest, that's Fort Jackson. It's one of the largest Army bases in the country. Below that is McEntire Joint National Guard Base. To the east is Shaw Air Force Base. And just below Shaw Air Force Base is the Poinsett Electronic Combat Range. You can see here that there's a large clustering of land application sites up here in the northeast. Throughout these watersheds, there's a handful of landfills, and there's a couple pre-treatment facilities over here in the western portion of this map. And within these watersheds is a relatively complex stream network here. So our plan here is going to develop, and elsewhere, is to really consider all of these facets together when developing our site sampling plan. So in closing, what have I learned so far? Life and career paths take unusual turns. I encourage you all to try new stuff. You don't know what you're gonna like. And this is one bit of information that my grad advisor, Brad, passed on to me as a grad student. He told me to view my graduate career as a training in research, not in a specific topic area. I mean, adaptability is key for marketing yourself. One of my biggest fears after I left GSO was that all of all of this academic work that I've done over the last 5 years is kind of going to go for naught. But what I have learned is that I can remain academically relevant, even though I did leave academia. I just had to position myself to do so. One bit of advice I think I would like to pass on to current students is to think about our academic questions through a transdisciplinary lens. Most topics we study transcend habitats, ecosystems, regions, and even science disciplines. We need to work together with industry, policymakers, social scientists, and economists to address societally relevant problems. And up here I have a handful of resources that they might find useful. And with that, I will close and thank you all for your attention here.
Oh, thanks, Matt, for a great talk. There's just the perfect talk to kick off our series here. Thank you so much. It was a really nice overview. You definitely have a lot to changes in your career. So we have some questions in the chat here. First, I want to let you know that Meredith talked to Pat Kelly, who says hi. He's in cruise prep mode, so we can't hear your talk. But he appreciates the shout out. And I saw him yesterday and told him about this, and he's going to be in quarantine for his cruise. So he'll probably look at your recording sometime over the weekend. So
sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, he was excited to hear you were here. Okay, we have a question from Sue Kennedy. Matt, could you speak to which supports or resources you found most helpful at GSO?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Public speaking for sure. The OCG 695 seminar, when I was going through GSO, it always felt like this thing was just going to come around every single year, year after year. But when I gave my first one, I was absolutely terrified. By the end, when I get up to year 4 or 5, I was really comfortable up in front of a public audience. And I think that was probably one of the things that I think helped me the most moving forward. So I would probably lean on OCG 695 as a really valuable resource.
All right. And also, please put questions in the chat. And Matt, I got a question for you. You've definitely, through your career, you've done a lot of different things, as you said. So what's the favorite thing that you've done?
That's a good question. I kind of break down the private sector work and the public sector work 2 ways. The private sector, I did a lot of good work there, but when you're billable, I kind of felt like, the creativity and the time to kind of just breathe and think, wasn't always there. I have that now, but the Alaska climate change project was absolutely fascinating. We partnered with EPA on that project. April Melvin was a AAAS fellow at the time, and she did an absolutely outstanding job. So I really enjoyed that project at IEC. But I think what I do like the most is I really like leading field programs. And in 2019 and 2020, I've probably been out on the lake 150 times just in the last year and a half or 2 years. So I'm out there all the time. And even though it's South Carolina in the summer, and it's crazy hot, I really enjoy field work, and I really enjoy managing field programs.
All right, good to know. So we have a question from Sarah Fuller, and she says, are you still in touch with your friends from your years at GSO? Can you talk about the personal relationships you formed while a student and how that may have impacted your path?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I was fortunate during my time at GSO. I mean, we had a really, really large but tight-knit circle. I still maintain contact daily with a lot of my friends. Sarah Fuller is one of them. But it's been nice to keep in touch with, some of my other friends. I have friends working for Delaware NEARS. I'm really good friends with Anupa Asokan. She's doing great work out with Surfrider for her 30 for 30 initiative. Yeah, it's been if nothing else, it's always inspiring to hear and kind of stay in touch with what my friends are doing, especially at GSO. I mean, we all do different stuff. Like I was a chemist, my friends were biologists, fishery scientists, they're, geologists, physicists, and, and it's always nice to hear about, what other people are doing, the diversity of work, even though we're all considered oceanographers, but the diversity of work is pretty wide. So I do enjoy hearing about what my friends are doing. I do keep in touch with them, a lot of them actually.
Oh, cool. Good to know. Do we have any other questions from the general audience there? I don't see anything else in the chat. Peter, did you see anything?
No, I think that's, oh, no, we did just get
Oh.
one that popped up.
Yeah, okay. One more question for you, Matt. Is there anything you would have done differently?
As far as grad school goes, I mean, I choose GSO 100 times over. I absolutely love my time there. I think the one aspect I probably would have liked to have gotten, or at least maybe worked into my thesis a little bit, was a more sound understanding of MATLAB and R. I'm pretty good in those programs nowadays, but it kind of came as a crash course after the fact. But I think if you have a pretty good understanding of how R and MATLAB work, I think that's a huge advantage for you in the private sector, and as well as, I use R all the time down here at DHEC. So understanding those sorts of those platforms are really useful.
Good to know. And we have another question. This is from Trisha, who's like here at GSO. What made you decide to pursue a career in the private sector right out of GSO as opposed to an academic postdoc?
No, that's a good idea. All right, that's a good question. And I don't have a good answer for you. I think I said early on that I didn't always know what came next, and this opportunity arose, and IEC was hiring people because, like I said, deep water had opened up, or NOAA had opened up the checkbook for deep water, and IEC was able to hire a bunch of people. And yeah, it just seemed like a good fit at the right time. I mean, it was early 2014 when I was starting to consider where I was going to go next. And this opportunity just arose, and I just took it. Didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I kind of just jumped in head first.
Sounds like a good reason. Okay, so I think that's, any other questions from the general audience here? Okay, so I think that's it. So at this point in time, we like to ask people to leave, unless you're a student or a recent grad, a recent alum, friend of Matt's. We'd like, please stay on for this informal discussion with Matt, and Sarah Neckford and Diana Fontaine are going to be moderating that section of it. And for the rest of you, this is the end of our formal presentation. Thank you so much for coming to attend our kickoff of our first of our alum seminar series. And just stay tuned, because we'll be having this every month. And in next month, we're going to be having Dana Rigneys McLaughlin, who's from NOAA. She'll be talking. And then in April, we're going to have Sarah Fuller, who works at Watola as the Research Vessel Science Coordinator. So watch your On the Waterfront and your emails for notices about those. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sarah and Diana.